Russia is one of the largest lands on Earth, a country of immense forests, frozen rivers, and endless open plains. But long before it became a powerful empire, these lands were quiet. Small villages stood alone beside slow rivers. Wooden houses gathered together in clearings among the trees. Families worked the soil, raised animals, and watched the long winters pass. Few people living in those distant centuries could imagine what their world would eventually become. Because over the next 1,000 years, these quiet lands would witness the rise of princes, the arrival of Viking traders, the devastation of Mongol armies, and the creation of one of the greatest empires in human history. An empire that would one day stretch across 2 continents, from the cold shores of the Baltic Sea into the distant Pacific Ocean. Tonight, we will slowly travel through that long and remarkable story. A story of rivers and forests, of kings and cities, of faith, war, and quiet everyday life. And like many great stories, this one begins beside a river. To understand how the Russian Empire was eventually born, we must travel back more than 1,000 years, to a time when Eastern Europe looked very different. A time when vast forests covered the land, and the great rivers quietly shaped the lives of the people who lived there. For more than 1,000 years, the lands of Russia have stretched across forests, rivers, and endless plains. It is a place where winter can last for months, where rivers freeze into silent roads of ice, and where small wooden villages once stood alone beneath wide northern skies. Long before the rise of great cities, before emperors ruled from golden palaces, these lands were home to scattered Slavic communities. Small villages lived beside quiet rivers. Smoke rose gently from wooden homes. Fields of grain moved softly in the wind, and deep forests surrounded everything. Life here followed the rhythm of nature. Summer brought long days of work in the fields. Autumn filled barns with harvest grain, and winter, long and still, covered the land in deep snow. But the rivers of this land connected distant worlds. The Dnieper, the Volga, and many smaller waterways slowly carried boats through the forests. These rivers became the highways of the early world. Merchants traveled along them. Explorers followed their winding paths, and sometimes warriors arrived from distant lands. Among those travelers were the Varangians, northern seafarers from Scandinavia. Today, we might call them Vikings. They sailed long wooden ships along the rivers, moving between the cold Baltic Sea in the north and the wealthy cities of the Byzantine Empire far to the south. They carried furs, honey, wax, and silver gathered through trade. But the Varangians were not only merchants, they were also warriors, restless travelers searching for opportunity. Slowly, their presence began to change the lands of the Eastern Slavs. According to old chronicles, the tribes of the region often argued among themselves. Many communities lived close together, but no single ruler united them. And so, the story tells us, they invited a Varangian leader to rule over them. His name was Rurik. In the year 862, Rurik and his followers arrived in the northern city of Novgorod. There, a ruling dynasty quietly began. Over time, Rurik's successors would travel south along the rivers, following the same trade routes used by merchants for generations. Eventually, their journey would lead them to a city beside the wide waters of the Dnieper River, a city that would soon become the center of a growing kingdom. That city was Kiev, and from its riverbanks, the story of Russia would truly begin. Slowly, life continued along the rivers of Eastern Europe. The lands of the early Slavic peoples were wide and quiet. Thick forests covered much of the north. Tall birch trees and dark pines stood close together, their branches whispering in the wind. Between these forests flowed long rivers, the Dnieper, the Volga, the Don, These rivers were the lifelines of the region. Villages formed beside their banks. Small wooden homes stood together in clusters, their roofs covered with straw or wooden shingles. Smoke drifted upward from stone hearths inside. Families lived simply. They grew grain in nearby fields. They kept animals through the long winters, and they gathered honey from wild forest bees. Life moved slowly. The rhythm of the seasons guided everything. Spring brought melting snow and rising rivers. Summer filled the forests with green leaves and birdsong. Autumn was the time of harvest. And winter. Winter was long and quiet. Snow covered the land for months. The rivers froze into wide roads of ice. Travel was slow, but people endured. Over time, these villages grew into larger settlements. Markets appeared along the riverbanks. Traders arrived from distant places. Some came from the south, from the rich cities of the Byzantine Empire. They carried fine fabrics, glass, and coins of silver and gold. Others came from the north. Sailors from Scandinavia, men who traveled in long, narrow ships. Their vessels could cross open seas, but also glide through shallow rivers. They were known as the Varangians. Tall, strong, and skilled at both trade and battle. At first, they were simply travelers passing through. They followed a long trade route that connected two distant worlds. From the Baltic Sea, they sailed south through rivers and lakes, eventually reaching the Black Sea and the grand markets of Constantinople. This route became famous in history. It was known as the route from the Varangians to the Greeks. Along this path, goods moved constantly. Furs from northern forests, wax from village beehives, honey, amber, and sometimes slaves taken in distant conflicts. In return, Byzantine merchants offered silver coins, fine jewelry, wine, and beautiful textiles. Slowly, these trade networks transformed the region. River towns grew busier, boats filled the docks. Languages from many lands could be heard in the markets. Some Varangian traders stayed. They married into local Slavic families. They built homes beside the rivers. And over generations, their cultures blended. Scandinavian warriors, Slavic farmers, and Byzantine merchants all left their mark on the growing society of Rus. Yet this world, though lively and prosperous, was not always peaceful. The Slavic tribes often competed with one another. Different communities controlled different stretches of river. Sometimes disputes over trade or territory led to small conflicts. Raids were not uncommon. Wooden walls surrounded many settlements, and watchmen stood guard near the riverbanks. Still, life moved forward. Generations passed quietly. Children grew up hearing stories of travelers from distant seas, of glittering cities far to the south, of powerful rulers and distant empires. Few could know that their small river towns, built from wood and earth, were slowly forming the foundations of something much larger. A loose network of tribes and settlements, connected by rivers and trade, was gradually becoming a shared cultural world. Historians would later call these people the Rus, and though the early communities remained simple, their location along the great rivers made them important. The waterways of Eastern Europe connected north and south, forest and steppe, village and empire. Through them flowed goods, ideas, and stories. And over time, those rivers would also carry the ambitions of rulers. Because the young dynasty begun by Rurik in the north was beginning to look beyond the forests of Novgorod. His successors understood something important. Whoever controlled the rivers controlled the trade, and whoever controlled the trade could grow powerful. Slowly, attention turned toward the south, or toward the wide and wealthy lands along the Dnieper River. There, stood a city that had grown steadily over generations, a city that merchants already knew well, a city that would soon become the heart of a new realm. That city was Kiev, and soon its quiet riverbanks would witness the rise of a kingdom. Far to the north, beyond the great river valleys of the south, stood one of the most important cities of the early Rus world, Novgorod. Unlike many small villages scattered across the forests, Novgorod was already a lively place. Wooden houses stood close together along narrow streets. Boats moved constantly along the nearby Volkhov River. Merchants arrived from many directions. Some came from the Baltic Sea. Others traveled from distant Slavic settlements deep within the forests. The city became a meeting place, a crossroads of cultures. Scandinavian traders spoke beside Slavic farmers. Northern furs were exchanged for southern silver. And slowly, a new political center began to form. According to one of the earliest chronicles of the region, the tribes living in these lands faced a difficult problem. They shared language and customs, but they lacked unity. Different clans competed for influence. Disputes sometimes turned into violence. And without a strong leader, order was difficult to maintain. So the story goes, the tribes made an unusual decision. They invited an outsider to rule over them, a Varangian leader from the north. His name was Rurik. In the year 862, Rurik arrived with his followers, warriors, sailors, and families who had traveled far from Scandinavia. They settled in Novgorod. From there, Rurik began to establish authority over the surrounding lands. His rule was not the creation of a large empire overnight. Instead, it was the quiet beginning of a dynasty. Over time, his family would control more territory along the river routes. Historians today debate how much of this early story is legend, but what is clear is that a ruling line known as the Rurikid dynasty did emerge during this period. And for centuries afterward, many of the princes who ruled the lands of Rus would claim descent from Rurik. After Rurik's death, power passed to his successor, a leader named Oleg. Oleg was both a warrior and a strategist. He understood something important about the geography of the region. The north was rich in furs and forest goods, but the greatest wealth flowed along the southern rivers, particularly the Dnieper. That river connected the forests of the north to the powerful Byzantine Empire far to the south. Controlling that route meant controlling trade, and trade meant power. So Oleg looked southward. Gathering warriors and allies, he traveled down the river routes, passing forests, lakes, and scattered settlements. Eventually, his forces reached a city that already stood as a thriving trading center, Kiev. The city rested along the banks of the Dnieper River. Its position made it a natural gateway between north and south. Merchants had passed through for generations. Boats loaded with furs and honey stopped here on their journey toward the Black Sea. But Kiev was more than a marketplace. It was also a strategic prize. In the year 882, Oleg captured the city, and instead of ruling from the north, he made an important decision. He moved the center of power. Kiev would become the capital of this growing realm. From this moment forward, the political heart of Rus shifted southward. The forests of Novgorod remained important, but Kiev now stood at the crossroads of trade, culture, and power. Chroniclers would later describe Oleg as a wise and cunning ruler. Under his leadership, the young state of Rus began to grow stronger. Trade expanded, fortifications were built, and diplomatic contact with distant lands increased. One of Oleg's most famous actions came during his dealings with the Byzantine Empire. Traveling south toward Constantinople, the great imperial city on the Bosporus, Oleg demonstrated the strength of his forces. Legends say he even hung his shield upon the gates of the city. Whether entirely true or not, the story reflects the growing confidence of the Rus' rulers. Treaties were signed, trade privileges were granted, and the river routes between north and south became even busier. Slowly, the loose network of Slavic settlements, trading towns, and Varangian outposts began to transform. A political structure was forming. Princes ruled important cities. Trade flowed through controlled routes, and alliances connected distant regions. This new realm would come to be known as Kievan Rus, a federation of lands linked by rivers, trade, and the authority of the Rurikid princes. Yet, despite its growing power, this early state remained fragile. Communication across the vast forests and plains was slow. Local rulers maintained significant independence, and the balance of power between different cities was delicate. Still, a foundation had been laid, a dynasty had begun, a capital had been established, and the rivers of Eastern Europe now carried not only merchants and travelers, but the ambitions of a rising kingdom. In the years that followed, new rulers would expand the influence of Kiev even further. Among them, one prince would make a decision that would shape the spiritual identity of the region for centuries. His name was Vladimir, and his choice would change the course of Rus's history forever. Slowly, the city of Kiev grew into something remarkable. Standing beside the wide waters of the Dnieper River, it became one of the most important crossroads of the early medieval world. Boats arrived from the north, gliding downriver from the forests of Novgorod. Other vessels came from the south, bringing goods from the rich markets of the Byzantine Empire. Along the riverbanks, wooden docks stretched into the water. Merchants unloaded furs, honey, wax, and amber gathered from the forests of the north. In return, they carried home silver coins, fine fabrics, and crafted goods from distant lands. The markets of Kiev slowly filled with many voices. Slavic traders spoke beside Varangian sailors. Greek merchants negotiated prices in quiet corners. Travelers from the steppe arrived on horseback. Each day, the city grew a little busier, a little wealthier, and gradually a little more powerful. Wooden walls surrounded the settlement. Tall gates opened toward the river roads. Inside those walls, life moved steadily forward. Blacksmiths shaped tools and weapons. Carpenters built houses from thick pine logs. Farmers from nearby villages brought grain and livestock into the city markets. At night, fires burned softly inside wooden homes. The sounds of conversation drifted through the streets. Children played near the riverbanks. And above everything, the wide sky of the eastern plains stretched endlessly. For many generations, Kiev remained the center of this growing world. Princes ruled from the city. They collected tribute from surrounding regions, and they protected the important trade routes that crossed their lands. Among the rulers of Kiev, one prince would become especially important. His name was Vladimir. History would later remember him as Vladimir the Great. When Vladimir came to power in the late 10th century, the realm of Rus had already become prosperous. Trade connected its cities to distant regions. But the people of the land followed many different beliefs. Some worshipped the old Slavic gods of nature. Others practiced traditions brought by travelers from distant lands. Temples and shrines stood in different places across the kingdom. Vladimir believed that a stronger spiritual unity could help stabilize his realm. According to the chronicles, he began to study the religions of neighboring civilizations. Envoys were sent across the world. Some traveled to the Muslim lands of the south. Others visited the Jewish communities of Khazaria. Still others journeyed to the powerful Christian empire of Byzantium. When the envoys returned, they brought stories of the great churches of Constantinople. They spoke of golden domes, glowing candles, and choirs whose voices echoed through vast halls of stone. The beauty of Byzantine worship left a powerful impression. In the year 988, Vladimir made a decision that would shape the identity of the Rus' lands for centuries. He accepted Christianity from the Byzantine Empire. Soon afterward, a great baptism took place in Kiev. According to tradition, many people of the city gathered beside the waters of the Dnieper River. Priests stood along the river banks. Prayers were spoken, and the people entered the water together, symbolizing the beginning of a new spiritual chapter. From that moment forward, Christianity slowly spread across the lands of Rus. Wooden churches appeared in towns and villages. Stone cathedrals were built in larger cities. Religious art and icons filled the interiors of sacred buildings. At the same time, a new writing system began to spread, the Cyrillic alphabet. Developed by scholars influenced by the Byzantine world, this script allowed religious texts and laws to be written in the language of the people. Books were copied by hand. Monasteries became centers of learning. And slowly, a written culture developed across the realm. Under Vladimir and his successors, Kievan Rus entered a period that historians often describe as its Golden Age. The most famous ruler of this era was Yaroslav the Wise. Yaroslav strengthened the political structure of the state. He encouraged the construction of new churches, and he supported the growth of education and law. One of the most important achievements of his reign was the creation of a legal code. It became known as Russkaya Pravda. This early system of laws helped regulate disputes, protect property, and guide the behavior of communities across the realm. Kiev itself continued to flourish. Large cathedrals rose above the skyline. The most famous of these was the Cathedral of St. Sophia. Its shining domes reflected sunlight across the city. Inside, beautiful mosaics decorated the walls. Merchants filled the markets. Travelers moved constantly along the river routes, and the city became one of the largest urban centers in Europe at that time. Yet, even during this golden age, the future held hidden challenges. The rulers of Rus followed a complex system of inheritance. Power passed between brothers, sons, and other members of the royal family. At first, this system seemed to maintain balance, but over time, it created rivalry. Princes competed for control of the most important cities. Local leaders grew stronger, and the unity of the realm slowly weakened. Few people living in the busy markets of Kiev could see the danger ahead. Trade still flourished. Church bells still echoed across the city. But gradually, the great state of Kievan Rus began to fragment. Separate principalities emerged. Different rulers claimed authority in distant regions, and beyond the eastern horizon, far across the grasslands of the Eurasian steppe, a powerful new force was rising, a force that would soon move westward, bringing with it one of the most dramatic invasions in medieval history. The Mongols were coming. For a time, the world of Kievan Rus seemed stable. Trade flowed steadily along the rivers. Church bells rang across growing cities, and the princes of the Romanov Dynasty ruled from Kiev with confidence. Yet beneath this calm surface, small tensions were beginning to appear. The realm of Rus was vast. Forests stretched for hundreds of miles. Rivers connected distant towns. But governing such a wide land was never easy. Communication was slow. Travel could take weeks, and power was shared among many members of the ruling family. The princes of the Romanov Dynasty followed a complicated tradition of inheritance. Instead of passing power directly from father to eldest son, authority often moved between brothers, cousins, and different branches of the royal family. At first, the system helped maintain balance. Each prince governed an important city: Novgorod, Smolensk, Suzdal, Chernihiv, and of course, Kiev. But over time, this delicate balance began to weaken. As generations passed, the number of princes grew larger. Each believed he had a rightful claim to power, and disagreement slowly turned into rivalry. Rivalry sometimes turned into war. Princes gathered their loyal warriors. Small armies marched between cities. Wooden fortresses were attacked, and alliances shifted again and again. For ordinary people, these conflicts brought uncertainty. Farmers continued to work their fields. Merchants still traveled along the rivers, but rumors of conflict moved quietly through towns and villages. In the north, the city of Novgorod grew increasingly independent. Its merchants became wealthy through trade with Scandinavia and the Baltic world. Local leaders began making decisions without always seeking approval from Kiev. Further east, new towns appeared in the forests. Places like Vladimir and Suzdal slowly developed into important regional centers. Their princes gained influence and sometimes challenged the authority of Kiev itself. Meanwhile, the steppe lands to the south remained dangerous. Nomadic tribes moved across the wide grasslands. Some traded peacefully with the cities of Rus. Others launched sudden raids. The princes of Rus often struggled to defend their borders, especially when they were busy fighting each other. Gradually, the unity of the old kingdom began to fade. Kiev remained a respected city. Its churches were still magnificent, its markets still busy, but its political authority weakened year by year. By the early 13th century, Kievan Rus had become a loose collection of separate principalities, each ruled by its own prince, each guarding its own interests. Few rulers were able to unite the entire realm again. Yet life continued. Children played beside wooden houses. Farmers harvested grain each autumn. Travelers still carried goods along the rivers. Most people believed the future would continue, much as the past had, but far beyond the eastern horizon. A powerful new force was rising. Across the vast grasslands of Central Asia, horsemen were gathering under the leadership of a remarkable conqueror. His name was Genghis Khan. Within a few decades, his empire would stretch across enormous distances. Cities would fall, kingdoms would collapse, and the armies of the Mongols, moving swiftly across the steppe, would eventually reach the lands of Rus. When they arrived, the divided princes of Kievan Rus would face one of the greatest challenges in their history, and the quiet river cities that had flourished for centuries would soon encounter a storm unlike any they had ever known. In the early years of the 13th century, a powerful movement was beginning far beyond the eastern horizon. Across the vast grasslands of Central Asia, tribes of nomadic horsemen had begun to unite. For generations, these riders had lived on the open steppe. They moved with their herds across wide plains. They slept beneath enormous skies. And from childhood, they learned to ride with extraordinary skill. Their horses were small, strong, and tireless. Their warriors carried bows that could strike with deadly accuracy even while riding at full speed. But what truly changed the balance of power across Asia was the leadership of one remarkable figure, a man known to history as Genghis Khan. Under his command, many steppe tribes joined together. Rival clans that had once fought among themselves now followed a single leader, and slowly their influence began to expand across the steppe. The Mongol armies moved quickly. They traveled enormous distances in short periods of time. Each warrior often rode several horses, changing mounts during long journeys. This allowed their armies to move with surprising speed. Cities that had never heard of the Mongols suddenly found their gates surrounded by silent riders. Kingdom after kingdom fell before them. Their empire expanded across Central Asia, into Persia, and toward the western steppe. At first, the distant lands of Rus seemed far away from these events. The forests and rivers of Eastern Europe felt removed from the struggles of the steppe. But in the year 1223, the two worlds would meet for the first time. News began to spread among the princes of Rus. A strange army had appeared beyond the steppe. Messengers carried troubling reports. Entire tribes had been defeated. Cities had fallen. The nomadic Cumans, longtime neighbors and sometimes rivals of the Rus' princes, were fleeing westward in fear. They brought urgent warnings. An unfamiliar enemy was approaching. At first, the princes of Rus were uncertain how to respond. Their lands were still divided into many separate principalities. Alliances between rulers were often fragile. Yet the threat seemed serious enough to demand cooperation. Several princes gathered their forces. Warriors from different cities assembled together. Their goal was to confront this mysterious army before it moved deeper into their lands. The two sides eventually met near a river called the Kalka. It was here, on the open steppe, that the princes of Rus first faced the Mongol army. The battle began with confidence among the Rus forces. Their warriors were experienced. Many had fought steppe raiders before. But the Mongol commanders used unfamiliar tactics. They moved quickly across the battlefield. Their horse archers fired arrows while riding in wide circles. Sometimes they appeared to retreat, drawing their enemies forward. Then, suddenly, they turned and attacked again. The battle at the Kalka River became chaotic. Different Rus princes commanded separate forces. Communication between them was difficult. Meanwhile, the Mongol army fought as a coordinated unit. Slowly, the battle turned against the Rus coalition. Many warriors were defeated. Several princes were captured. And when the battle finally ended, the Mongols had demonstrated the strength of their armies. Yet, strangely, they did not immediately conquer the lands of Rus. After their victory, the Mongol forces turned back toward the east. For a time, the forests and river cities of Rus returned to their familiar rhythms. Markets reopened. Church bells rang again. And many people hoped that the mysterious riders from the steppe would not return. But history was only pausing, not ending. Because within a generation, a new Mongol leader would march westward. His name was Batu Khan. He was a grandson of Genghis Khan, and his armies would soon move across the steppe with a clear goal: the conquest of the lands of Rus. By the late 1230s, the Mongol armies began their advance. One by one, cities along the eastern frontier faced the storm. The first major target was the city of Ryazan. Its wooden walls stood against the cold winter sky. The people inside prepared for defense, but the Mongol armies were relentless. Their siege machines broke through the city's defenses. The walls collapsed, and the city fell. In the years that followed, other cities met similar fates. Vladimir, Suzdal. Many towns across the region were attacked. Some resisted bravely, others fell quickly. The Mongol armies moved steadily forward. Winter did not slow them. Their horses traveled easily across frozen rivers. The forests that had once protected the lands of Rus now offered little defense. And finally, in the year 1240, the Mongol forces reached the most famous city of all, Kiev. For centuries, this city had stood as the heart of the Rus world. Its churches rose above the river. Its markets welcomed travelers from distant lands. But now, a vast army gathered outside its walls. The defenders of Kiev fought bravely. Yet the Mongol siege engines slowly broke through the city's defenses. Walls collapsed. Gates were shattered. And after a long struggle, the Mongol army entered the city. Many buildings were destroyed. Fires spread across the streets, and the once great capital of Kievan Rus fell into silence. With the fall of Kiev, the political center of the old Rus world was broken. The princes who survived would soon face a new reality. For the next 2 centuries, the lands of Rus would live under the shadow of a powerful Mongol state, a state known as the Golden Horde. And during this long period, a small forest city far to the northeast would quietly begin its rise, a city called Moscow. After the fall of Kiev, the lands of Rus entered a long and unfamiliar period. The great cities still stood beside their rivers. Villages still worked the fields. Church bells still echoed across the countryside. But above all of this, a new power now ruled the region. The Mongol state that controlled these lands became known as the Golden Horde. Its rulers governed from cities far to the south on the wide grasslands of the steppe. From there, they supervised a vast territory stretching across many different peoples and cultures. Unlike many conquerors, the Mongol rulers did not attempt to replace the local princes of Rus. Instead, they demanded loyalty, and they demanded tribute. The princes of the Rus lands were required to travel to the court of the Mongol Khan. There, they would receive a document granting them the right to rule. This document was called a yarlik. Without it, a prince could not claim authority over his own city. The journey to the Mongol court could be long and difficult. Princes traveled across forests, rivers, and open steppe. When they arrived, they stood before the Khan and pledged their loyalty. Some rulers returned with power confirmed. Others did not return at all. Yet, despite this new system of control, daily life for many people in the Rus lands continued in familiar ways. Farmers still planted grain each spring. Beekeepers gathered honey from forest hives. Merchants carried goods along the rivers. The Orthodox Church also remained an important part of society. In many cases, the Mongol rulers allowed the church to continue its work without interference. Monasteries remained places of learning. Priests recorded events in chronicles, and faith continued to guide the lives of many communities. Still, the presence of Mongol authority could always be felt. Officials traveled between cities to collect tribute. Taxes were carefully counted. Silver coins, furs, and goods were sent south toward the Golden Horde. For the princes of Rus, this period required patience and careful diplomacy. Open rebellion would bring destruction, but loyalty could bring advantage. Some princes learned how to navigate this new political world. Among them, one city in particular began to grow quietly stronger. That city was Moscow. In the early years of Mongol rule, Moscow was only a small settlement surrounded by forests. Its wooden walls were modest. Its population was limited. Yet its location proved valuable. The forests around the city provided natural protection. Trade routes passed nearby, and its rulers slowly built strong relationships with the Mongol authorities. One prince played an especially important role in this rise. His name was Ivan I. History would later remember him as Ivan Kalita. The name Kalita meant money bag. It reflected his reputation for gathering wealth and influence. Ivan Kalita served the Mongol Khans faithfully. He helped collect tribute from other Rus's princes, and in return, he gained the trust of the Golden Horde. This trust brought advantages. Wealth flowed into Moscow. Land was purchased from neighboring rulers, and slowly, the influence of the small forest city began to expand. Another important development also strengthened Moscow. The leader of the Russian Orthodox Church decided to move his residence there. When the Metropolitan relocated from Kiev to Moscow, the city gained new spiritual importance. Pilgrims arrived, clergy gathered, and Moscow began to grow not only as a political center, but also as a religious one. Over time, its princes gained more authority among the lands of Rus. While other cities struggled with rivalry and conflict, Moscow expanded patiently. Its rulers avoided open rebellion against the Mongols. Instead, they worked carefully within the system of tribute and diplomacy. Little by little, their influence grew. Yet the Mongol presence across the steppe still remained powerful. For more than 2 centuries, the shadow of the Golden Horde shaped the history of the Rus lands. Princes ruled their cities, but above them stood the authority of the Khans. Many people living during these years could not imagine a different future. The Mongol order seemed permanent. The tribute continued. The journeys to the Khan's court continued, and life moved forward beneath the quiet forests and wide skies of the north. Yet history rarely remains unchanged forever. Across the lands of Rus, new ambitions were slowly taking shape. Princes began to dream of independence. Cities grew stronger, and among them all, the rising power of Moscow was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. In the years ahead, this quiet forest city would lead the first great challenge against Mongol authority. And that challenge would take place on a wide open battlefield beside a river called Kulikovo. For many decades, the princes of the Ruslands lived under the authority of the Golden Horde. Tribute was collected. Messengers traveled between cities, and the power of the Mongol Khans remained strong across the steppe. Yet slowly, the balance of power began to shift. Within the lands of Rus, several cities continued to grow in strength. Among them, Moscow was becoming increasingly influential. Its princes had carefully navigated the complex political world created by Mongol rule. They gathered wealth, they strengthened alliances, and they expanded their control over neighboring territories. One of the most important rulers of Moscow during this time was a prince named Dmitry. History would later remember him as Dmitry Donskoy. He came to power in the late 14th century, and during his reign, the ambitions of Moscow began to change. For generations, the princes of Rus had accepted Mongol authority. Open resistance seemed impossible. The armies of the Golden Horde had once defeated powerful kingdoms across Eurasia. But the Mongol world itself was beginning to experience internal struggles. Different leaders competed for influence. Some regions of the Horde grew less stable. Sensing this moment of uncertainty, Dmitry began preparing for a confrontation that earlier rulers had avoided. He strengthened the defenses of Moscow. Wooden walls were replaced with stronger fortifications. Warriors from different Rus lands were invited to join his cause. Gradually, an alliance began to form. Princes who had once competed with one another now recognized the growing power of Moscow. Some offered their support. Others watched carefully from a distance. Meanwhile, on the southern steppe, a powerful Mongol commander named Mamai gathered his own forces. Mamai was not the Khan of the Golden Horde, but he controlled a large army and significant influence. When he learned of Dmitry's growing power, he prepared to confront the rising Prince of Moscow. Both sides began moving toward the same region, a wide area of open land where 2 rivers met. This place would become known as the Kulikovo Field. The year was 1380. In the early autumn, the armies approached the battlefield. The warriors of Rus gathered under the banners of several princes. Infantry soldiers carried spears and shields. Mounted warriors waited beside their horses. Priests moved among the soldiers, offering prayers and blessings before the coming struggle. Across the open plain, the Mongol army prepared as well. Their horse archers were experienced fighters. For generations, they had mastered the tactics of the steppe: speed, mobility, and the deadly accuracy of mounted archery. As morning light spread across the field, both sides waited in silence. Mist drifted above the nearby river. The grass moved gently in the wind. Then slowly, the battle began. At first, the fighting was intense and uncertain. The Mongol cavalry attacked with speed. Arrows moved across the battlefield. Lines of soldiers advanced and retreated. The noise of combat spread across the open field. For hours, the outcome remained unclear. Then, at a critical moment, a hidden reserve force of Rus's cavalry joined the battle. These warriors had been waiting within a nearby forest. When they finally charged onto the battlefield, their arrival changed the balance of the fight. The Mongol forces began to lose their advantage. Slowly, their lines weakened. And by the end of the day, the army of Dmitry had achieved a remarkable victory. The Battle of Kulikovo did not immediately end Mongol authority over the lands of Rus. Tribute would continue for some time. Yet the meaning of the battle was profound. For the first time in many generations, a united army of Rus's princes had defeated a major Mongol force in open battle. The victory spread quickly through towns and villages. Stories of the battle traveled across the forests and rivers, and the reputation of Moscow grew stronger than ever. Prince Dmitry received a new title after the battle. He became known as Dmitry Donskoy, a name that connected him forever to the river Don near the battlefield. The victory at Kulikovo became a symbol, a reminder that Mongol power was not invincible. In the years that followed, Moscow continued to expand its influence. More territories accepted its leadership. More princes aligned themselves with its rulers. And slowly, the idea of a united Russian land began to take shape again. Yet, the final end of Mongol authority would still require time. Nearly another century would pass before the princes of Moscow could finally stand free of the Golden Horde. But the path toward that future had begun on the quiet fields of Kulikovo, and the small forest city of Moscow was now becoming the center of a rising power. After the victory at Kulikovo, the influence of Moscow continued to grow. Yet the power of the Golden Horde had not completely disappeared. Tribute was still collected. Messengers still traveled between the steppe and the forests of Rus, and the princes of Moscow still needed to navigate a careful path between ambition and caution. Over time, however, the Mongol world itself began to change. The once powerful Golden Horde slowly weakened. Internal rivalries divided its leadership. Different factions competed for authority, and the vast empire created by the descendants of Genghis Khan gradually fragmented into smaller states. This shift created new opportunities for the rising princes of Moscow. Among them, one ruler would play a decisive role in shaping the future of the Rus lands. His name was Ivan. History would remember him as Ivan III. He came to power in Moscow in the year 1462. By this time, the city had already grown into the strongest political center among the Rus principalities. But Ivan had ambitions that went beyond simple regional leadership. He dreamed of uniting the scattered lands of Rus under a single authority. Slowly, patiently, he began expanding Moscow's influence. Some territories were gained through diplomacy. Others were acquired through marriage alliances, and occasionally through war. One of Ivan's most important rivals was the powerful city of Novgorod. For centuries, Novgorod had been a wealthy trading republic. Its merchants maintained connections with the Baltic world and the Hanseatic League. The city governed itself through a council of influential families, and it had long resisted the growing power of Moscow. But Ivan III believed that the unity of the Rus lands required the incorporation of Novgorod. After a series of political disputes and military confrontations, his forces defeated the city in the late 15th century. Novgorod was absorbed into the expanding territory of Moscow. Its independence came to an end. This victory greatly strengthened the position of the Moscow prince. Yet an even greater challenge remained. Although the Golden Horde had weakened, its rulers still claimed authority over the lands of Rus. The tribute system had not entirely disappeared, and the Khans still expected loyalty from the northern princes. By the late 15th century, a confrontation between Moscow and the Mongol world was becoming increasingly likely. The moment finally arrived in the year 1480. A Mongol ruler known as Ahmed Khan gathered his forces and advanced toward the territories of Moscow. Ivan III responded by assembling his own army. Warriors from many regions joined him. The two armies eventually approached each other near a river called the Ugra. For weeks, they faced one another from opposite sides of the water. The autumn air grew colder. Mist rose above the river each morning. Soldiers waited silently along the banks. Neither side rushed into battle. Both armies watched carefully. Both commanders understood the importance of the moment. The standoff continued day after day, then gradually. As winter approached, the Mongol forces began to withdraw. The confrontation ended without a major battle, yet its significance was enormous. For the first time in more than 2 centuries, the princes of Moscow no longer acknowledged the authority of the Mongol Khans. The long period often described as the Mongol yoke had finally come to an end. The lands of Rus were no longer required to send tribute southward, and Moscow stood as the strongest power in the region. Under Ivan III, the city continued to transform. New walls of red brick were built around the Kremlin. Churches rose above the skyline. Foreign architects arrived from Italy to help design impressive new buildings. Moscow was no longer simply a forest stronghold. It was becoming the capital of a new and expanding state. Ivan also strengthened the symbolism of his rule. Through marriage, he connected his dynasty with the legacy of the Byzantine Empire. His wife, Sophia, was related to the last Byzantine imperial family. After the fall of Constantinople in 1453, many Orthodox Christians began to look toward Moscow as a new center of their faith. Gradually, a powerful idea began to spread. The idea that Moscow was the third Rome. The first Rome had fallen long ago. The second Rome, Constantinople, had been conquered by the Ottoman Empire. But Moscow remained, a strong Orthodox kingdom in the north. A place where both political authority and religious tradition could continue, whether fully accepted or not. This idea helped strengthen the prestige of Moscow's rulers. The Prince of Moscow increasingly appeared not just as a regional leader, but as the ruler of a broader Russian realm. By the end of Ivan III's reign, much of the territory once associated with Kievan Rus had come under Moscow's influence. The long era of fragmentation was slowly ending. A new centralized state was beginning to take shape, and the rulers of Moscow were preparing to assume an even more powerful title. Soon, the princes of this rising state would no longer call themselves simply princes. They would adopt a title that reflected their growing authority, a title that would echo across the centuries of Russian history. The title of Tsar. By the early 16th century, the power of Moscow had grown far beyond its modest beginnings. What had once been a small forest city now stood at the center of an expanding state. The rulers of Moscow governed wide territories. Princes from many regions acknowledged their authority, and slowly, the scattered lands of the old Russ's world were becoming more united. In the year 1533, a young boy inherited this growing realm. His name was Ivan. History would later know him as Ivan IV, but he would become famous under another name, Ivan the Terrible. When Ivan first became ruler, he was only 3 years old. The government of Moscow was therefore managed by powerful noble families known as the boyars. These noble clans competed for influence within the royal court. They advised the young prince. They controlled the administration of the state. and sometimes they struggled against one another for power. For the young Ivan, these early years were difficult. Court politics could be harsh and unpredictable. The boyars often placed their own interests above those of the young ruler. Stories from later chronicles describe a childhood filled with tension and isolation. Ivan grew up watching the rivalries and intrigues of the court around him. These experiences would shape his personality in the years to come. When Ivan reached adulthood, he moved quickly to assert his authority. In the year 1547, a significant ceremony took place in Moscow. Ivan was crowned with a new and powerful title. He became the first ruler of Russia to officially take the title of Tsar. The word Tsar was derived from the ancient title of Caesar. It symbolized imperial authority. By adopting this title, Ivan presented himself not simply as a prince among other princes, but as the supreme ruler of a vast state. The coronation took place within the great cathedrals of the Kremlin. Priests conducted elaborate ceremonies. Nobles gathered to witness the event, and the young ruler of Moscow stepped into a new role in Russian history. In the early years of his reign, Ivan focused on strengthening the administration of the state. New councils of advisors helped guide government policy. Legal reforms were introduced, and efforts were made to organize the growing army of the Russian state. One of the most notable military developments of this period was the creation of the Streltsy. These soldiers formed one of the first permanent firearm units in Russia. They carried early muskets and served as an important part of the Tsar's military forces. Under Ivan's leadership, the Russian state also expanded its territory. To the east, two powerful Tatar Khanats controlled important regions along the Volga River. These were the Khanate of Kazan and the Khanate of Astrakhan. Both had historical connections to the Mongol world, and both remained significant regional powers. Ivan launched military campaigns against these states. After long preparations, Russian forces captured the city of Kazan in 1552. This victory was a major turning point. It extended Russian control deep into the Volga region. Just a few years later, Astrakhan also fell under Russian influence. These conquests opened new routes toward the vast lands beyond the Ural Mountains. They also increased the prestige of Ivan's rule. For a time, his reign appeared successful and promising. The state grew stronger, the army expanded, trade routes developed along the Volga River, and Moscow continued to grow as the capital of an emerging empire. Yet, despite these achievements, the personality of Ivan IV remained complex. Those who lived near the court observed moments of brilliance, but also moments of deep anger and suspicion. Events in his personal life would soon affect his rule in unexpected ways. The death of his beloved wife Anastasia deeply affected the Tsar. After her passing, Ivan became increasingly distrustful of those around him. He suspected that enemies might be plotting against him within the court. Gradually, his rule began to change. Decisions became harsher. Punishments became more severe, and the relationship between the Tsar and the noble families of Russia grew more tense. In the years that followed, this growing distrust would lead Ivan to create one of the most feared institutions in Russian history, a system of power that would transform the political life of the country, a system known as the Oprichnina. In the years following the death of his wife, Tsar Ivan IV began to change. Those who observed the ruler noticed a growing sense of suspicion in his behavior. The court of Moscow had always been a place of rivalry and political maneuvering. But now, Ivan began to see enemies everywhere. He feared betrayal from the noble families known as the boyars. Some of these nobles had once dominated the government during his childhood. Others still held large estates and great influence across the country. To Ivan, their power appeared dangerous. Gradually, the Tsar came to believe that hidden conspiracies threatened his authority, and so, in the year 1565, Ivan made a decision that would transform the political life of Russia. He divided the country into two separate regions. One would remain under the traditional system of government, and the other would become a new territory directly controlled by the Tsar himself. This new domain was known as the Oprichnina. Within this territory, Ivan ruled with absolute authority. He created a special force of loyal followers known as the Oprichniki. These men served as both soldiers and enforcers. They wore dark clothing, and according to many descriptions, their saddles carried strange symbols: a broom and the head of a dog. These symbols represented their mission: to sniff out treason and sweep away the enemies of the Tsar. The Oprichniki rode through the countryside on dark horses. Their presence quickly became a source of fear. Nobles suspected of disloyalty were arrested. Estates were confiscated. Families were forced to leave their lands. Many regions of Russia experienced sudden waves of punishment and investigation. At times, entire communities became caught in these sweeping actions. The city of Novgorod was among the most famous examples. For centuries, Novgorod had been one of the great cities of the Rus world. Its merchants had traded across the Baltic Sea. Its churches had stood proudly along the river. But during the time of the Oprichnina, Ivan came to believe that the city might be plotting against him. In the winter of 1570, the Tsar and his Oprichniki marched toward Novgorod. What followed became one of the darkest episodes of his reign. Investigations were carried out. Suspected conspirators were punished. Many people suffered under the harsh measures imposed by the Tsar's forces. The once prosperous city endured a difficult and tragic period. Across the rest of the country, similar patterns appeared. The Oprichnina created deep fear among the noble families. It weakened the traditional power of the boyars, but it also disrupted the stability of the state. Agricultural lands were abandoned. Trade slowed in some regions, and many people struggled to understand the changes taking place around them. Even Ivan himself seemed increasingly troubled. His moods shifted between moments of energy and moments of deep anger. Those closest to the Tsar sometimes found his behavior unpredictable. One tragic event later became one of the most famous stories associated with his reign. During a moment of intense anger, Ivan struck his own son, the heir to the throne. The young prince was severely injured, and not long afterward, he died. The loss deeply affected the Tsar. It also created uncertainty about the future leadership of the state. Despite the fear created by the Oprichnina, Ivan eventually ended the system. By the early 1570s, the separate territory of the Oprichnina was dissolved. The country returned to a more traditional administrative structure, yet the impact of those years remained. Many noble families had been weakened. Large territories had changed ownership, and the memory of the Oprichniki left a lasting impression in Russian history. When Ivan IV finally died in 1584, he left behind a country that was larger than the one he had inherited. Russia now controlled the Volga region and new lands toward the east, but the political system remained fragile. The death of the Tsar would soon create a new period of uncertainty, because the heir to the throne, his son Fyodor, was not a strong ruler, and the centuries-old dynasty founded by Rurik was approaching its end. In the years that followed, Russia would enter one of the most chaotic periods in its history, a time remembered as the time of troubles. After the death of Tsar Ivan IV, the Russian state entered a period of uncertainty. The vast territories that Ivan had ruled now faced an unclear future. His son, Fyodor, inherited the throne. Yet Fyodor was not known for strong leadership. He was a quiet and deeply religious man. Much of the real authority within the government fell to powerful advisors at court. Among these advisors, one figure gradually rose to prominence. His name was Boris Godunov. Godunov had served under Ivan IV and possessed considerable political skill. Over time, he became the most influential figure in the Russian government. When Tsar Fyodor died in 1598 without leaving an heir, the long-ruling dynasty of Rurik finally came to an end. For more than 7 centuries, princes claiming descent from Rurik had ruled the lands of Rus. Now, that ancient line had disappeared. A council of nobles and church leaders gathered to determine the future of the throne. After careful discussion, they chose Boris Godunov as the new Tsar. At first, his rule appeared stable. Godunov attempted to strengthen the administration of the country. He supported education and encouraged the development of new towns. But difficulties soon appeared. In the early years of the 17th century, a series of natural disasters struck the land. Several years of poor harvests created widespread famine. Crops failed across many regions. Food became scarce, and thousands of people suffered through the harsh conditions. Entire villages struggled to survive. Many families left their homes in search of food. The difficult years between 1601 and 1603 left deep scars across the country. At the same time, rumors began to spread. Some people believed that the throne rightfully belonged to a surviving son of Ivan IV. Years earlier, a young prince named Dmitri had died under mysterious circumstances. But now, a man appeared claiming to be that very prince. He declared himself Dmitri, the rightful heir to the Russian throne. This figure became known to history as the first false Dmitri. His appearance created confusion and excitement among many people. Some nobles supported his claim. Others doubted his story. Yet the unrest of the time made it easier for such rumors to spread. The false Dmitri gathered supporters and moved toward Moscow. Before long, Tsar Boris Godunov died suddenly in 1605. Without his leadership, the government quickly lost stability. The supporters of the false Dmitri entered the capital, and for a brief moment he was crowned as Tsar. But his rule did not last long. Within a year, a group of nobles organized a revolt against him. The false Dmitri was overthrown and killed, yet the chaos did not end. Soon, another pretender appeared, and then another. Each claimed to be the rightful heir to the throne. These figures became known collectively as the false Dmitris. Their claims deepened the confusion already spreading across the country. At the same time, foreign powers began to take interest in Russia's instability. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to the west saw an opportunity to expand its influence. Polish forces supported some of the pretenders, and eventually, their armies advanced into Russian territory. By the year 1610, Polish troops had reached Moscow itself. The capital of Russia fell under foreign occupation. For many people across the country, this was a shocking moment. The ancient city of Moscow, the center of the Russian state, was now controlled by outside forces. Yet the occupation also inspired resistance. Across towns and villages, groups of citizens began organizing their own defense. Merchants, soldiers, and ordinary townspeople joined together. In the city of Nizhny Novgorod, a merchant named Kuzma Minin called upon the population to support a new army. He was joined by a noble commander named Prince Dmitry Pozarsky. Together, they organized a volunteer force determined to liberate Moscow. In 1612, this army marched toward the capital. After a difficult struggle, the Polish garrison inside the Kremlin surrendered. The city was freed. The long period of chaos had not yet fully ended, but hope began to return. Soon afterward, representatives from across the country gathered in a national assembly known as the Zemsky Sobor. Their task was to choose a new ruler who could restore stability. In the year 1613, the assembly selected a young nobleman named Mikhail Romanov. He was only 16 years old, yet his family possessed respected connections within Russian society. With his election, a new dynasty began. The Romanov Dynasty would rule Russia for more than 3 centuries, and with the rise of this new royal house, the long and troubled time of troubles finally came to an end. After years of chaos, Russia finally began to find stability again. The election of Mikhail Romanov in 1613 marked the beginning of a new chapter in the country's long history. The young ruler, who now wore the crown of Tsar, was only 16 years old. He had grown up during the difficult years of the time of troubles. War, famine, and political uncertainty had shaped the world around him. For this reason, many people hoped that his reign might bring peace and reconstruction. The Romanov family was respected among the Russian nobility. They also possessed strong connections to the Orthodox Church. These connections helped strengthen Mikhail's legitimacy as the new ruler of Russia. But the country he inherited faced enormous challenges. Many towns had been damaged by war, fields had been abandoned, trade had declined, and the authority of the central government needed to be rebuilt. During the early years of Mikhail's reign, an important figure helped guide the government. This was his father, Filaret. Filaret served as the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church. Although Mikhail held the title of Tsar, Filaret played a major role in directing the administration of the state. Together, father and son worked to restore order across the country. Gradually, the government began repairing the structures of the Russian state. Tax systems were reorganized, local officials were reappointed, and diplomatic relations with neighboring countries were slowly restored. Peace treaties were signed with Sweden and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. These agreements helped end the long wars that had drained the country during the previous decades. With stability returning, life across Russia slowly improved. Farmers returned to their fields. Villages that had been abandoned were rebuilt. Merchants resumed travel along the river routes that connected distant regions of the country. The Russian Orthodox Church also regained influence during these years. Monasteries expanded their lands. Clergy played an important role in local communities. And religious traditions continued to shape everyday life. Yet, even as the country recovered, new developments were quietly changing the future of Russia. To the east, vast territories stretched beyond the Ural Mountains. These lands were rich in forests, rivers, and valuable animal furs. For many years, Russian explorers and traders had gradually moved into these distant regions. Now, under the stability provided by the Romanov government, these journeys increased. Groups of adventurers known as Cossacks traveled across the frontier. They moved along rivers, built small forts, and established trading posts. These outposts often became the first Russian settlements in the enormous region known as Siberia. The expansion across Siberia would become one of the most remarkable geographic movements in world history. Within a relatively short period of time, Russian explorers traveled thousands of miles across northern Asia. They followed rivers through dense forests. They crossed mountains and tundra, and eventually they reached the distant shores of the Pacific Ocean. This expansion greatly increased the size of the Russian state. It also connected Russia with new trade opportunities across Asia. At the same time, the authority of the Tsar continued to strengthen. The Romanov Dynasty worked to centralize power in Moscow. Noble families still held influence, but the monarchy gradually became the dominant force within the political system. Over the decades, the foundations of a new Russian state took shape, a state that was larger, more organized, and increasingly confident. By the middle of the 17th century, the worst memories of the time of troubles had begun to fade. A new generation had grown up under the Romanov rulers. Cities were rebuilding, trade networks expanded, and the territory of Russia stretched further across the continent than ever before. Yet, the process of expansion and centralization would also bring new tensions. Conflicts over land, religion, and social structure were beginning to emerge. In the years ahead, these tensions would shape the development of Russia under the later Romanov rulers, and they would help prepare the stage for one of the most dramatic transformations in Russian history: the arrival of a ruler whose ambition would change the country forever. A ruler remembered today as Peter the Great. By the end of the 17th century, Russia had become an enormous country. Its territory stretched across forests, rivers, and plains that seemed almost endless. Yet despite its size, the nation remained relatively isolated from much of Europe. Travel between Russia and the Western kingdoms was limited. New scientific ideas and technological developments moved slowly across the borders. Many traditions within Russian society still followed customs that had changed little over centuries. Then, in the year 1672, a child was born who would dramatically reshape the future of the country. His name was Peter. History would remember him as Peter the Great. Peter grew up in an environment very different from that of earlier Russian rulers. During his youth, he became fascinated with technology, engineering, and navigation. Unlike many young nobles of his time, Peter enjoyed learning practical skills. He studied the construction of ships, he observed the operation of workshops and tools, and he showed great curiosity about the wider world beyond Russia's borders. When Peter eventually became Tsar, he quickly began to imagine a different future for his country. He believed that Russia needed to learn from the more technologically advanced societies of Western Europe. But rather than simply sending diplomats abroad, Peter decided to travel there himself. In 1697, he organized a remarkable journey known as the Grand Embassy. Accompanied by advisors and craftsmen, Peter traveled across Europe. He visited cities in the Dutch Republic, England, and other European states. What made this journey unusual was Peter's approach to learning. Instead of remaining distant as a royal observer, he often worked directly alongside local craftsmen. In the shipyards of the Netherlands, Peter helped build ships with his own hands. He studied the techniques used by European shipbuilders. He examined the design of naval fleets, and he gathered knowledge that he believed could transform Russia's future. The journey also allowed Peter to observe other aspects of European life. He saw universities, scientific institutions, and organized military systems. All of these experiences convinced him that Russia must modernize if it wished to become a powerful state. When Peter returned to Moscow, he began implementing sweeping reforms. Some of these changes affected the appearance of Russian society itself. Traditional long beards had been common among Russian nobles. Peter believed this custom symbolized resistance to modernization. He introduced a famous policy known as the beard tax. Men who wished to keep their beards were required to pay a special tax. Many nobles therefore adopted the clean-shaven style common in Western Europe. Clothing styles also changed. Peter encouraged the nobility to adopt Western fashions. Long traditional robes were replaced with European-style coats and uniforms. These visible reforms symbolized deeper changes taking place within the state. Peter reorganized the structure of government. He reduced the influence of older noble families. In their place, he created a new system of service to the state. One of the most important of these reforms was known as the Table of Ranks. This system allowed individuals to rise in status through government or military service. Promotion depended less on noble birth and more on loyalty and ability. The Russian military also underwent significant transformation. Peter introduced new training methods for soldiers. He expanded the use of artillery and firearms, and most importantly, he began building a powerful navy. Russia had long been a land-based power, but Peter believed that access to the sea was essential for trade and international influence. In order to achieve this goal, Russia would soon enter one of the most important conflicts of Peter's reign, a long and difficult struggle against the powerful Swedish Empire. This conflict would become known as the Great Northern War, and it would determine whether Russia could finally open a window to the Western Seas. For Peter the Great, this struggle was not simply about territory. It was about transforming Russia into a modern European power, a transformation that would soon lead to the creation of a remarkable new city, a city built on the edge of the Baltic Sea, a city that Peter hoped would become Russia's gateway to the wider world. That city would be called St. Petersburg. At the end of the 17th century, one of the most powerful kingdoms in Northern Europe was Sweden. Under the leadership of its energetic kings, the Swedish Empire controlled large territories surrounding the Baltic Sea. Its armies were respected across the continent. Its navy dominated the northern waters, and its influence reached many regions that Russia hoped to access. For Tsar Peter, this situation presented a serious obstacle. Russia remained largely cut off from the Baltic Sea. Without access to these waters, trade with Western Europe was difficult. Peter believed that if Russia wished to become a strong and modern state, it needed a port connected to the Baltic. Achieving this goal would require confronting Sweden. In the year 1700, a large coalition formed against the Swedish Empire. Russia joined forces with Denmark and the Kingdom of Poland-Lithuania. Their shared objective was to weaken Swedish dominance in the Baltic region. The Swedish king at that time was Charles XII. Although he was young, he proved to be an exceptionally talented military leader. Early in the war, Swedish forces achieved surprising victories. One of the most dramatic of these occurred near the Russian fortress of Narva. The Russian army had gathered there in great numbers. Yet, despite their numerical advantage, they faced a highly disciplined Swedish force. In the winter of 1700, Charles XII led his soldiers through a snowstorm and attacked the Russian positions. The Swedish army broke through the Russian lines. The battle ended in a major defeat for Peter's forces. For many rulers, such a loss might have ended the campaign. But Peter the Great reacted differently. Instead of abandoning the war, he treated the defeat as a lesson. He began reorganizing the Russian military. New training programs were introduced. Weapons production expanded, and officers were encouraged to study modern military tactics. Over the next several years, the Russian army slowly improved. At the same time, Peter began constructing a fleet on the Baltic coast. Shipyards appeared along newly captured territories. Sailors were trained, and Russia gradually developed a navy capable of operating in northern waters. Meanwhile, Charles XII continued his military campaigns across Europe. He defeated several of Russia's allies. For a time, the Swedish king appeared unstoppable. Eventually, his attention turned once again toward Russia. In 1708, Charles XII launched a bold invasion. His army marched deep into Russian territory. Yet, the Russian strategy had changed. Instead of seeking a quick confrontation, Peter's forces withdrew slowly across the countryside. They removed supplies that the Swedish army might use. Villages were abandoned. Food stores were destroyed. This strategy made it difficult for the Swedish army to sustain its advance. Winter conditions further complicated the campaign. The long Russian winter placed enormous strain on soldiers far from home. By the following year, the Swedish army had become weaker and exhausted. In 1709, the two armies finally met near the city of Poltava. This battle would become one of the most decisive moments in the war. Peter personally commanded the Russian forces. The army he led was far stronger and better organized than the one defeated at Narva years earlier. When the battle began, the Russian troops held their positions with discipline. Artillery supported their lines. Infantry formations moved carefully across the field. After hours of fighting, the Swedish army could no longer maintain its strength. The Russian forces gained the advantage. And by the end of the battle, the army of Charles XII had been decisively defeated. The victory at Poltava changed the course of the war. Sweden's power in the region declined rapidly. Russia emerged as the new dominant force in the Baltic. For Peter the Great, this success confirmed the effectiveness of his reforms. The Russian army had transformed from a struggling force into a powerful military institution, but the consequences of the war extended beyond the battlefield. During the conflict, Peter had already begun building something extraordinary, a new city on the Baltic coast, a city that would symbolize Russia's new connection with Europe, a city built among marshlands and rivers near the sea. That city, St. Petersburg, would soon become the new capital of the Russian state. While the Great Northern War continued, Tsar Peter the Great began working on one of the most ambitious projects in Russian history. On the northern coast of the Baltic Sea, near the mouth of the Neva River, a new city would rise. This region had once been controlled by Sweden. It was a landscape of marshes, low islands, and winding channels of water. In many places, the ground was soft and wet. Tall grasses grew beside the shallow rivers, and thick fog often drifted across the wetlands. To many observers, this seemed like an unlikely place to build a great city. But Peter saw something different. He saw a gateway to Europe. For centuries, Russia's main centers of power had been deep inside the continent. Cities like Moscow stood far from the sea. Peter believed that if Russia was to become a modern power, it needed a direct connection to the waters of the Baltic. So, in the year 1703, construction of the new city began. Workers arrived from many regions of the Russian state. Soldiers, peasants, craftsmen, and engineers gathered along the banks of the Neva River. Their task was enormous. They needed to transform the marshlands into a functioning city. The early years of construction were difficult. Wooden piles were driven deep into the soft ground to support buildings. Channels were dug to control the movement of water. Bridges connected the small islands scattered across the delta. Day after day, laborers worked through mud and rain. Stone and timber were transported from distant regions. The scale of the project demanded enormous effort. Many thousands of workers took part in the construction. For some, the harsh conditions of the marshlands proved extremely challenging. Yet the work continued. Peter personally supervised many aspects of the project. He walked through the construction sites. He inspected the progress of fortifications and docks. And he encouraged architects and engineers to design buildings inspired by European styles. At the heart of the new city, a strong fortress rose beside the river. This became known as the Peter and Paul Fortress. Its walls protected the growing settlement, and its cathedral would later become the burial place of Russian emperors. Around the fortress, streets and canals gradually appeared. New houses were built for merchants and government officials. Shipyards developed along the riverbanks. Soon, ships constructed in Russian yards began sailing into the Baltic Sea. The city slowly took shape. Peter gave it a name that reflected both his own identity and his admiration for European culture: St. Petersburg. The name echoed the traditions of Western Europe, and it symbolized the new direction Peter wanted Russia to follow. The Tsar also encouraged nobles and government officials to move there. Many aristocratic families were required to build homes in the new city. Government offices gradually relocated from Moscow. Diplomats from foreign countries established embassies along its growing streets. In time, St. Petersburg became the political center of the Russian state. But it was more than just a capital. Peter intended it to be a symbol, a window to the West. Through this city, Russia could communicate with Europe more directly. Trade ships arrived from distant ports. Scholars and engineers traveled to the new capital. Ideas and technologies moved more freely across the borders. The appearance of the city also reflected Peter's vision. Wide avenues replaced the narrow streets common in older Russian towns. Canals crossed the city like those of Amsterdam. Elegant buildings faced the waterways. And gradually, St. Petersburg became known as one of the most impressive cities in Northern Europe. By the final years of Peter's reign, the transformation of Russia was clearly visible. The country now possessed a modernized army. A growing navy sailed across the Baltic, and a new capital stood proudly beside the sea. These changes marked the beginning of a powerful new era. Russia was no longer an isolated landlocked kingdom. It had become an emerging European empire, and the city of St. Petersburg would remain at the center of that empire for generations to come. When Peter the Great died in 1725, Russia stood very different from the country he had inherited. The army had been modernized. A navy sailed across the Baltic Sea, and the new capital of St. Petersburg connected Russia more closely with Europe. Yet Peter left behind an unexpected problem. He had never clearly named a successor. The question of who should rule the empire now remained uncertain. Without a clear heir, power struggles quickly appeared inside the royal court. During the years that followed, Russia entered a period historians often call the Age of Palace Coup. This era was marked by sudden changes in leadership. Rulers rose to power with the support of powerful nobles and elite military units. And sometimes, those same forces removed them from power just as quickly. The first ruler after Peter's death was his wife, Catherine I. She had not been born into royal nobility. In fact, her early life had been very humble. Yet, during Peter's reign, she had gained his deep trust and loyalty. With the support of influential advisors and the imperial guards, Catherine was declared Empress of Russia. Her reign lasted only a few years. Real authority during this period was largely exercised by members of the royal court and military leaders. After Catherine's death in 1727, the throne passed to a young ruler, Peter II. He was the grandson of Peter the Great, but like many rulers of this era, his time on the throne was short. Peter II died at a very young age once again. The empire faced uncertainty about its leadership. The Russian nobility now turned to another member of the royal family, Anna Ivanovna. Anna became empress in 1730. At first, some noble leaders hoped they could limit her authority. They attempted to place restrictions on her power through a set of political conditions. But Anna rejected these limits. With support from loyal military forces, she quickly restored full imperial authority. During her reign, Russia continued to function as a strong monarchy. Government institutions established under Peter the Great remained in place, and the empire maintained its position as an important European power. Yet the atmosphere at court during Anna's rule sometimes became controversial. Certain advisors gained enormous influence over government decisions. Many members of the nobility resented this concentration of power. Still, the state itself remained stable. After Anna's death in 1740, another complicated succession crisis appeared. The next ruler was an infant, Ivan VI. Because the child was too young to govern, regents attempted to rule on his behalf. But this fragile arrangement did not last long. only a year later. Another dramatic change occurred. In 1741, Elizabeth Petrovna, the daughter of Peter the Great, organized a coup. With the support of the Imperial Guard regiments, she seized power in St. Petersburg. The young Ivan VI was removed from the throne. Elizabeth became Empress of Russia. Her reign would last for 2 decades, and under her leadership, Russia entered a period of cultural and political development. Elizabeth admired the legacy of her father. She supported education, the arts, and architecture. During her reign, the famous Winter Palace in St. Petersburg was expanded. Grand churches and public buildings were constructed. The city became even more impressive as the capital of the empire. Elizabeth also played an important role in European politics. Russian armies participated in the 7 Years' War. This conflict involved many of the major powers of Europe. At one point during the war, Russian forces even entered the city of Berlin. Although the political situation later changed, the campaign demonstrated the growing strength of the Russian military. Throughout these decades of shifting rulers, the structure of the empire created by Peter the Great remained intact. Government institutions continued functioning. The army remained powerful, and St. Petersburg stood firmly as the imperial capital. Yet the era of palace intrigue was not completely finished. Another dramatic change of leadership would soon occur, one that would bring to the throne one of the most famous rulers in Russian history. A woman remembered today as Catherine the Great. In the middle of the 18th century, a remarkable figure rose to power in the Russian Empire. She had not been born in Russia. Her early life began far away in a small German principality. Her birth name was Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst. Few people in her childhood could have imagined that she would one day rule one of the largest empires in the world. As a young woman, Sophie was chosen to marry the future Russian emperor. She traveled to Russia as a teenager. There, she converted to the Russian Orthodox faith. She adopted a new name, Catherine. Her marriage connected her to the Russian imperial family. Yet, life within the court of St. Petersburg was often complicated. Her husband, Peter III, eventually became emperor in 1762. But his reign lasted only a short time. Many members of the Russian nobility and military disliked his policies. He admired the Kingdom of Prussia and reversed several alliances that Russia had previously maintained. These decisions caused tension among the elites of the empire. Catherine quietly observed the situation around her. Over time, she built relationships with influential officers and members of the Imperial Guard. In the summer of 1762, a dramatic change occurred. With the support of key military units, Catherine organized a palace coup. Peter III was removed from power, and Catherine was proclaimed Empress of Russia. From that moment forward, she ruled as Catherine II. History would remember her as Catherine the Great. Catherine was deeply interested in ideas emerging across Europe during this period. The 18th century was known as the Age of Enlightenment. Philosophers and writers debated questions about government, law, education, and human rights. Catherine read many of these works with great interest. She corresponded with famous thinkers such as Voltaire and Denis Diderot. Inspired by these ideas, she attempted to reform certain aspects of Russian law and administration. One of her early projects was a document known as the Nakaz. This text outlined Catherine's ideas about justice, governance, and legal reform. It drew inspiration from Enlightenment philosophy. Although not all of its proposals were fully implemented, the Nakaz demonstrated Catherine's desire to modernize the legal system of the empire. At the same time, Catherine understood the realities of ruling such a vast country. The Russian Empire stretched across enormous distances. Its population included many different peoples, languages, and traditions. Maintaining stability required strong authority. For this reason, Catherine often balanced reform with firm control over the government. Her reign became known for both intellectual curiosity and political strength. One of the most dramatic challenges of her rule occurred in the 1770s. During this time, a large uprising broke out among peasants and frontier communities. The rebellion was led by a man named Yemelyan Pugachev. He claimed to be the true emperor and promised freedom from the hardships faced by many rural people. Large areas of the Volga region experienced unrest. Several towns fell under the control of rebel forces. For a time, the uprising created serious concern within the government. Eventually, imperial troops defeated the rebellion. Pugachev was captured and executed. The revolt ended, but it reminded Catherine of the deep tensions that existed within Russian society. Despite these challenges, Catherine's reign is often remembered as a period of cultural growth and imperial expansion. The arts flourished in St. Petersburg. Libraries and schools developed, and the imperial court became an important center of European intellectual life. At the same time, Russia's territory continued to expand. To the south, the empire fought several wars against the Ottoman Empire. These conflicts eventually allowed Russia to gain access to the Black Sea. New ports and naval bases were established along its shores. One of the most significant acquisitions was the Crimean Peninsula. By incorporating Crimea into the empire, Russia strengthened its presence in the southern region. Meanwhile, dramatic events were also taking place in Central Europe. The once powerful Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had entered a period of political weakness. Neighboring powers began dividing its territory. Russia participated in these partitions alongside Prussia and Austria. As a result, large areas of Eastern Europe came under Russian control. By the final years of Catherine's reign, the Russian Empire had grown larger and more influential than ever before. Its armies were respected across Europe. Its culture attracted artists and scholars. And its capital city stood as one of the great centers of the continent. When Catherine the Great died in 1796, she left behind a powerful empire that stretched across vast lands from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Yet the stability of this empire would soon face new tests, because in the early 19th century, Europe would enter a period of enormous upheaval, a period shaped by revolution, war, and the rise of one of the most famous military leaders in history, Napoleon Bonaparte. In the early 19th century, Europe was changing rapidly. Revolution had shaken the political order of France. From these turbulent years, a new leader rose to prominence. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon was an extraordinary military commander. Through a series of remarkable victories, he expanded French influence across much of the European continent. Kings and emperors watched his rise with both fascination and concern. For many years, Russia was one of the powers involved in the shifting alliances of the Napoleonic Wars. Tsar Alexander I ruled the Russian Empire during this period. He was the grandson of Catherine the Great. Like many rulers of Europe, Alexander struggled to balance diplomacy and resistance in dealing with Napoleon's growing power. At times, Russia cooperated with France. At other moments, the two empires stood in opposition. One important agreement between them was the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807. After earlier conflicts, Napoleon and Alexander met along the Niemen River. They negotiated a temporary alliance. For a short time, relations between France and Russia appeared stable. But beneath the surface, tensions remained. Economic pressures, political disagreements, and competing ambitions gradually weakened the partnership. By the year 1812, the relationship between the two empires had broken down completely. And Napoleon made a bold decision. He would invade Russia. The army he assembled for this campaign was enormous. It became known as the Grande Armée. Soldiers from many different nations marched under Napoleon's command. French troops formed the core of the force. But the army also included soldiers from across Europe. When the invasion began in the summer of 1812, hundreds of thousands of soldiers crossed the Russian frontier. Their objective was clear: advance rapidly, defeat the Russian army, and force Tsar Alexander to negotiate peace. Yet the Russian commanders adopted a different strategy. Instead of confronting Napoleon immediately in a single decisive battle, they slowly withdrew deeper into the country. As they retreated, they removed supplies that the invading army might use. Food stores were burned. Villages were abandoned. Fields were left empty. This approach made it increasingly difficult for the Grande Armée to sustain its advance. The Russian countryside grew quieter as the French army moved forward. Days passed, weeks passed. The invading forces marched further and further east. Eventually, the two armies finally met in a massive confrontation near the village of Borodino. The battle took place in September of 1812. It became one of the largest and most intense battles of the entire Napoleonic Wars. Russian forces defended their positions with determination. Napoleon's troops attacked repeatedly. By the end of the day, thousands of soldiers on both sides had been killed or wounded. The battlefield fell silent. Although the French army held the field after the battle, the Russian army remained intact. It withdrew again, continuing the strategy of retreat. Soon afterward, Napoleon reached the city of Moscow. For centuries, Moscow had been one of the most important cities of Russia. Its churches and palaces had witnessed many chapters of Russian history, but when Napoleon's army entered the city, they found it largely deserted. Many residents had already fled. Soon, fires began spreading through the streets. The flames grew across the wooden buildings of the city. Large sections of Moscow burned. Napoleon waited there, hoping that Tsar Alexander would ask for peace, but no such request came. Weeks passed. Supplies grew scarce, and the approaching Russian winter began to threaten the invading army. Eventually, Napoleon made the difficult decision to retreat. The journey westward became extremely difficult. Cold weather arrived, food was limited. Russian forces harassed the retreating army along the roads. The once powerful Grande Armée gradually weakened. By the time the survivors crossed back into Europe, only a fraction of the original army remained. The campaign of 1812 became one of the most famous events in European history. For Russia, it was remembered as a patriotic struggle to defend the homeland. For Napoleon, it marked the beginning of the end of his power. In the years that followed, European armies eventually defeated him. But within Russia, the victory created a new sense of national confidence. Russian troops even marched into Paris in 1814. Yet the aftermath of these events would also bring new ideas into Russian society. Ideas about reform, liberty, and political change. And these ideas would soon inspire a small group of officers to challenge the authority of the Tsar himself. After the defeat of Napoleon, Russia entered a new phase of its history. The country had emerged from the long wars as one of the most powerful states in Europe. Russian armies had marched across the continent. They had fought battles in distant lands. And eventually, they had entered the city of Paris itself. For many Russian officers, these experiences left a lasting impression. While traveling across Europe, they had encountered societies that looked different from their own. They saw countries where political systems included written constitutions. Some states allowed broader participation in government. Intellectual discussions about liberty and reform were common in many European cities. When these officers returned home to Russia, they carried these ideas with them. Back in St. Petersburg and Moscow, they began gathering in small circles to discuss the future of their country. These groups remained secret. Their members believed that Russia needed political reforms. Some argued that the power of the Tsar should be limited by a constitution. Others believed that serfdom, the system binding millions of peasants to the land, should be abolished. These discussions gradually developed into organized movements. Among the most important were two groups known as the Northern Society and the Southern Society. Both organizations consisted largely of educated officers from the Russian army. Although they disagreed on certain details, they shared a common belief that Russia needed political change. For several years, their activities remained hidden from the authorities. But events in the imperial family soon created an unexpected opportunity. In 1825, Tsar Alexander I died suddenly. His death created confusion regarding the line of succession. Many people believed that his brother Constantine would become the next emperor, but Constantine had secretly renounced the throne. The crown would instead pass to another brother, Nicholas. During this brief period of uncertainty, members of the reformist societies decided to act. In December of that year, a group of officers and soldiers gathered in St. Petersburg. They assembled in Senate Square, refusing to swear loyalty to the new Tsar. Their goal was to demand political reform and a constitutional system. The moment became known as the Decembrist Revolt. The atmosphere in the square was tense. Soldiers stood in formation. Officers attempted to persuade others to join their cause, but the uprising lacked clear coordination. Meanwhile, Nicholas acted quickly to secure control of the situation. Loyal government forces surrounded the rebels. Negotiations failed to resolve the standoff. Finally, artillery was brought into position. Cannon fire broke the lines of the insurgents. The revolt ended quickly. Many participants were arrested. The leaders of the movement were later tried and punished. Some were executed. Others were sent into exile in the distant lands of Siberia. For Tsar Nicholas I, the revolt left a deep impression. He saw it as a warning about the dangers of political dissent. During his reign, Nicholas strengthened the authority of the state. Censorship increased. Secret police monitored political activity, and the government emphasized loyalty to the traditional pillars of Russian society. These pillars were often summarized in a famous phrase: orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. Together, they represented the principles that Nicholas believed should guide the empire. For the next 3 decades, Russia remained a powerful but tightly controlled state. The empire continued expanding across its vast territories. Yet, beneath the surface, many social and economic challenges remained unresolved. Millions of peasants still lived under the system of serfdom. Industrial development lagged behind that of Western Europe, and political reform remained limited. These tensions would eventually contribute to a new crisis, one that would reveal the weaknesses of the Russian Empire in the middle of the 19th century. A conflict remembered as the Crimean War. By the middle of the 19th century, the Russian Empire remained one of the largest and most powerful states in the world. Its territory stretched across enormous distances. Its armies were large, and its rulers still governed through the strong authority of the Tsar. Yet beneath this appearance of strength, serious weaknesses were beginning to emerge. Industrial development in Russia was slower than in many parts of the Western Europe. Railways were limited, modern factories were fewer, and the organization of the army still relied on systems that had changed little over generations. These hidden problems would soon become visible during an international conflict, a conflict known as the Crimean War. The origins of the war involved several complex political issues. One important factor concerned the declining power of the Ottoman Empire. For many years, European states had debated what might happen if the Ottoman territories weakened further. Russia hoped to expand its influence in regions surrounding the Black Sea. The Russian government also presented itself as a protector of Orthodox Christians living under Ottoman rule. Tensions between Russia and the Ottoman Empire gradually increased. In 1853, war finally began. Russian forces moved into territories controlled by the Ottomans. At first, the conflict appeared to favor Russia. But the situation soon changed. Other European powers grew concerned about the expansion of Russian influence. Britain and France decided to support the Ottoman Empire. Their governments feared that a stronger Russia might disrupt the balance of power across Europe. As a result, the conflict widened into a much larger war. British and French forces prepared an expedition to challenge Russian power directly. Their strategy focused on a region of great importance to Russia, the Crimean Peninsula. This peninsula extended into the Black Sea, and it contained one of Russia's most important naval bases, the port city of Sevastopol. In 1854, Allied armies landed on the Crimean coast. Their objective was to capture Sevastopol and weaken Russia's naval presence in the region. The campaign that followed was long and difficult. One of the early confrontations occurred near the Elma River. There, Allied forces defeated Russian troops and continued advancing toward Sevastopol. Soon afterward, the city became the center of a prolonged siege. Russian soldiers and civilians worked together to defend the port. Fortifications were strengthened, artillery positions were constructed, and supplies were carefully managed. For nearly a year, the siege continued. Both sides endured difficult conditions. Battles took place along trenches and defensive lines. Winter weather brought additional hardship. Disease spread among soldiers in crowded camps. The Crimean War also revealed the changing nature of warfare. New technologies began to influence the battlefield. Steam-powered ships transported supplies. Improved rifles increased the range and accuracy of soldiers. Telegraph communications allowed news from the front to travel more quickly than ever before. For the Russian Empire, the conflict gradually exposed serious disadvantages. Allied armies possessed stronger industrial support. Their supply systems were more efficient, and their transportation networks allowed reinforcements to arrive faster. Eventually, after months of fighting, Russian defenses at Sevastopol could no longer hold. In 1855, the city fell to the Allied forces. The loss marked a turning point in the war. Soon afterward, peace negotiations began. The conflict ended in 1856 with the Treaty of Paris. Under the terms of the treaty, Russia agreed to several restrictions in the Black Sea region. The defeat shocked many observers inside the Russian Empire. For decades, Russia had been seen as one of the dominant military powers of Europe. Now, the war had revealed that the country lagged behind in technology and organization. Many leaders began to realize that change was necessary. Reform could no longer be postponed. A new Tsar had come to power during the war, Alexander II. He understood that the future strength of Russia would depend on modernization, and in the years that followed, he would introduce one of the most important reforms in Russian history: the emancipation of millions of peasants who had lived 4 centuries under the system of serfdom. When the Crimean War came to an end, many leaders of the Russian Empire understood that the country stood at an important crossroads. The defeat had revealed serious weaknesses. Military organization needed improvement. Industry and transportation required modernization, and the social structure of the empire was increasingly difficult to maintain. At the center of these challenges stood a system that had shaped Russian society for centuries: serfdom. Millions of peasants across the empire lived under this system. They were legally bound to the land owned by nobles. Their ability to move freely was limited, and their labor formed the foundation of the rural economy. By the middle of the 19th century, many observers believed that this system prevented Russia from modernizing. Tsar Alexander II recognized the urgency of the situation. He believed that reform must come from the government itself. As he famously remarked, it was better to abolish serfdom from above than to wait for it to be destroyed from below. In 1861, Alexander issued one of the most important decrees in Russian history, the Emancipation Edict. With this declaration, more than 20 million serfs were granted legal freedom. They were no longer bound directly to the estates of their landlords. In principle, they could marry without permission, own property, and move to different regions. The reform represented a major transformation in Russian society, yet the process was complicated. Former serfs received the land from the estates on which they had lived, but in many cases, they were required to make long-term payments for that land. These redemption payments could last for decades. As a result, many peasants remained in difficult economic circumstances. Despite these challenges, the emancipation of the serfs was a historic step. It changed the relationship between millions of rural people in the state, and it opened the possibility for further reforms. Alexander II introduced several additional changes during his reign. The judicial system was reorganized. New courts were established with clearer legal procedures. Trials became more transparent. Juries were introduced in certain cases. These changes aimed to create a more consistent system of justice across the empire. Local government also experienced reform. New administrative bodies known as zemstvos were created. These councils operated at the provincial and district levels. They managed practical matters such as roads, schools, and public health. Although their authority remained limited, the zemstvos provided new opportunities for local participation in government. Military reform also became a priority. The Russian army introduced new training systems, and in 1874, a universal system of military service replaced the older recruitment practices. These reforms improved the efficiency of the armed forces. Education expanded as well. New schools were founded. Universities attracted growing numbers of students. Literature and intellectual debate flourished in the cities of the empire. Yet, the period of reform also produced new tensions. Many educated Russians hoped that the changes would eventually lead to broader political freedoms. But the imperial system still concentrated authority in the hands of the Tsar. Some groups began to believe that deeper transformation was necessary. Among these groups, revolutionary movements slowly emerged. Young intellectuals traveled to rural villages, hoping to inspire political awareness among the peasantry. Others organized secret societies dedicated to radical change. These movements often disagreed about methods and goals, but they shared a belief that Russia needed a different political future. As the years passed, the atmosphere within the empire grew increasingly complex. Reforms had improved many aspects of society, yet expectations continued to rise. Some people demanded faster progress. Others feared that the reforms had already gone too far. In this climate of uncertainty, a small but determined revolutionary organization appeared. Its members believed that violence could force the government to accept political change. This group became known as the People's Will, and their actions would soon bring the era of Alexander II to a dramatic and tragic conclusion. During the later years of Alexander II's reign, the atmosphere within the Russian Empire became increasingly tense. The reforms of the previous decades had changed many aspects of society. Millions of former serfs had gained legal freedom. New institutions had appeared within local government. Education and intellectual life were expanding in the cities. Yet, for many people, these reforms did not go far enough. Some intellectuals believed that Russia still lacked meaningful political participation. Others argued that the power of the Tsar remained too strong. These frustrations gave rise to new revolutionary movements. At first, many reformers hoped that peaceful discussion might encourage further change. Students and writers debated political ideas. Small groups organized to promote social reform. But as time passed, some activists grew impatient. A more radical approach began to emerge. One of the most determined revolutionary groups of this period became known as Narodnaya Volya. In English, the name is often translated as the People's Will. Members of this organization believed that dramatic action could force the government to introduce political reforms. Their strategy focused on targeting symbols of imperial authority, including the Tsar himself. Throughout the late 1870s, several attempts were made on Alexander II's life. Some plots involved explosives placed along railway lines. Others attempted attacks in public streets. Each time, the Tsar survived. Security around the imperial court increased, but the revolutionary organization remained determined. Finally, on a winter day in March of 1881, their plan succeeded. Alexander II was traveling through the streets of St. Petersburg in his carriage. As it moved along the canal near the Winter Palace, a bomb was thrown toward the vehicle. The explosion damaged the carriage but did not immediately kill the Tsar. Witnesses later described how Alexander stepped out of the carriage to see what had happened. At that moment, a second attacker approached. Another explosive device was thrown. The second explosion severely injured the emperor. He was carried back toward the palace, but his wounds were too severe. Shortly afterward, Alexander II died. News of the assassination spread quickly across the empire. For many people, the death of the Tsar was deeply shocking. Alexander II had been remembered as the ruler who freed the serfs. Yet his efforts at reform had not protected him from revolutionary violence. The government responded swiftly. Members of the People's Will organization were arrested. Several of the conspirators involved in the attack were tried and executed. The assassination also brought a new ruler to the throne, Alexander III. Unlike his father, the new Tsar believed that strong authority was necessary to preserve order. He distrusted many of the liberal ideas that had circulated during the previous decades. Under Alexander III, the government reversed some of the reformist momentum. Political control became stricter. Police surveillance increased, and the state placed greater emphasis on traditional values and imperial authority. Censorship expanded. Universities were monitored more closely. The government promoted a policy sometimes described as Russification. This policy encouraged the spread of Russian language and culture throughout the diverse regions of the empire. Despite these political restrictions, Russia also experienced rapid economic development during this period. Industrial production began to expand. Railway networks grew across the country. Factories appeared in major cities such as Moscow and St. Petersburg. A new urban working class gradually formed. These changes brought both opportunity and difficulty. Workers faced long hours and challenging conditions. Cities grew quickly as people moved from rural villages in search of employment. By the end of the 19th century, the Russian Empire had become a society of striking contrasts. Grand imperial palaces stood beside crowded industrial neighborhoods. Vast rural estates existed alongside rapidly growing factories. The empire appeared powerful, but beneath the surface, new social tensions were forming. These tensions would soon shape the final years of Imperial Russia, because the next ruler, Nicholas II, would inherit a country standing on the edge of profound transformation. When Alexander III died in 1894, the Russian Empire passed to his eldest son, Nicholas II. He was young, quiet in temperament, and deeply devoted to the traditions of monarchy. Nicholas believed strongly in the idea that the Tsar ruled by divine authority. For him, the imperial throne was not merely a political office, it was a sacred duty, a responsibility given by God to guide and protect the nation. Yet the Russia that Nicholas inherited was changing rapidly. Factories were expanding in major cities. Railroads stretched across the vast landscape of the empire. New industries produced steel, coal, and machinery. Large numbers of people were leaving rural villages and moving toward urban centers. These changes created opportunity, but they also brought new difficulties. Factory workers often lived in crowded conditions. Working hours were long. Wages were low. In many industrial districts, social tensions began to grow. Looking back today, one can sense that Russia, at the turn of the 20th century, stood at a delicate moment. It was a powerful empire, yet also a society undergoing enormous transformation. The traditional system of autocratic rule was being asked to govern a rapidly modernizing country, and this was not an easy balance to maintain. Nicholas II himself believed that preserving the authority of the monarchy was essential for stability. He was cautious about political reform. Some advisors encouraged limited changes to the system of government, but Nicholas worried that weakening imperial authority might lead to chaos. From his perspective, the empire could only remain united if the Tsar remained firmly in control. This belief shaped many of the decisions he made during his reign. Meanwhile, another figure was slowly becoming known within the royal court. A wandering religious mystic named Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin came from a rural background in Siberia. He gained attention among certain members of the aristocracy because of his reputation for spiritual insight. Eventually, he was introduced to the imperial family. The Tsar and his wife Alexandra faced a deeply personal concern. Their son, the young heir to the throne, suffered from a serious illness known as hemophilia. When Rasputin appeared able to calm the boy during episodes of illness, the Empress developed great trust in him. Over time, his presence at court became controversial. Some nobles believed he exercised too much influence over the royal family. Rumors spread throughout the capital, and Rasputin became a symbol of the growing distrust many people felt toward the imperial government. While these tensions developed at home, Russia also faced challenges abroad. In the early years of Nicholas's reign, the empire became involved in a conflict far from its traditional European borders: the Russo-Japanese War. This war began in 1904. It centered on competing interests in East Asia, particularly in regions such as Manchuria and Korea. Many Russian leaders believed their empire possessed overwhelming strength, but events soon revealed a different reality. Japanese forces launched swift and effective attacks. Russian armies suffered a series of defeats. One of the most dramatic moments occurred at sea. In 1905, the Russian Baltic Fleet sailed halfway around the world to confront the Japanese Navy. When the fleets finally met near the island of Tsushima, the result was devastating for Russia. Much of the fleet was destroyed. The war ended soon afterward with a peace agreement. For many Russians, the defeat was deeply humiliating. It also intensified the dissatisfaction that already existed within society. Later that same year, a peaceful demonstration took place in St. Petersburg. Thousands of workers marched toward the Winter Palace. They hoped to present a petition asking for better working conditions and political reforms. The protesters believed the Tsar might listen to their concerns, but events took a tragic turn. Imperial troops fired upon the crowd. The day became known as Bloody Sunday. The shock of the event spread rapidly across the empire. Strikes erupted in many cities. Protests and unrest appeared across factories, railways, and universities. In response to the crisis, Nicholas II agreed to introduce limited reforms. He issued a document known as the October Manifesto. It promised certain civil liberties and the creation of a legislative assembly called the Duma. For a moment, it seemed that Russia might move toward a more constitutional system. Yet the changes remained incomplete. The Tsars still retained significant authority, and the tensions within Russian society did not disappear. Looking back now, one might say that Russia stood at a crossroads. A path toward gradual reform remained possible, but so too did the possibility of deeper upheaval. History often reveals how fragile such moments can be, and in the years ahead, events would move quickly. War, economic strain, and political unrest would combine in ways few people could fully anticipate. These forces would soon push the Russian Empire toward its final and most dramatic transformation. In the summer of 1914, Europe moved toward a war unlike anything it had experienced before. Alliances formed quickly. Nations mobilized their armies, and across the continent, millions of soldiers prepared for a conflict that few truly understood. The Russian Empire entered the war as part of an alliance with France and Britain. For many Russians, the first days of the war were filled with patriotic emotion. Crowds gathered in city squares. Church bells rang. Newspapers printed messages calling for unity and sacrifice. At that moment, many people believed the war might strengthen the nation. But as the months passed, the reality of the conflict began to appear. Russia possessed one of the largest armies in the world. Yet its equipment and supply systems were often inadequate. Railways struggled to deliver weapons and food to distant battlefronts. Soldiers sometimes fought without proper rifles. Others lacked boots or warm clothing during the bitter winters. Looking back now, it becomes clear that the war placed enormous strain on a system that was already fragile. The Russian Empire had entered the 20th century carrying many unresolved tensions, and the pressures of total war only magnified them. Early battles against Germany revealed serious difficulties. Two major defeats occurred at the Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes. Entire Russian armies were surrounded and destroyed. News of these disasters spread quickly through the country. Families waited anxiously for letters from the front. Many never received them. By 1915, Tsar Nicholas II made a decision that historians still debate. He chose to personally assume command of the Russian army. In one sense, this decision reflected his strong belief in the duty of a monarch. He wished to stand beside his soldiers and defend the empire. Yet the consequences were complicated. From that moment onward, military failures were increasingly associated with the Tsar himself. Meanwhile, in the capital city, the government struggled to manage the growing crisis. Food shortages became more common. Factories slowed production. Transportation networks were overwhelmed by the demands of war. At court, the influence of Rasputin continued to generate controversy. Many politicians believed the government was losing credibility. Rasputin himself was eventually assassinated in 1916 by a group of aristocrats who feared his influence had damaged the monarchy. But by then, the damage to public trust had already been done. And as the winter of 1917 approached, conditions within the capital grew increasingly tense. Bread became difficult to obtain. Workers stood in long lines outside bakeries. In February of that year, demonstrations began in the streets of Petrograd. At first, these gatherings focused on food shortages, but soon they expanded into broader protests against the government. Factories closed. Workers joined marches across the city. Crowds grew larger each day. The government ordered troops to restore order. Yet something unexpected happened. Some soldiers refused to fire upon the demonstrators. Instead, many of them joined the crowds. This moment marked a dramatic turning point. Once the army in the capital ceased supporting the government, the authority of the monarchy weakened rapidly. In March of 1917, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated the throne. After more than 3 centuries, the Romanov Dynasty had come to an end. Looking back on these events today, one cannot help but notice how quietly the old order collapsed. There was no single moment that shattered the empire overnight. Rather, the system seemed to lose its strength little by little. War, economic strain, and political mistrust gradually eroded the foundations of imperial rule. In place of the monarchy, a new government appeared. It was known as the Provisional Government. Its leaders hoped to guide Russia toward democratic reform. But the situation remained unstable. Another political force was also gaining influence, a revolutionary movement that had been waiting for an opportunity to reshape the entire structure of society. A movement led by a determined figure named Vladimir Lenin. And before long, that movement would take control of the revolution itself. After the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II, Russia stood in a moment of profound uncertainty. The old imperial order had disappeared, but the future of the country was still unclear. In Petrograd, a new authority known as the Provisional Government attempted to guide the nation through this turbulent period. Its leaders believed Russia could become a modern, democratic state. They promised civil liberties, freedom of speech, and plans for future elections. Yet, the provisional government faced enormous challenges from the very beginning. The war with Germany continued. Food shortages remained severe. Factories struggled to maintain production. And across the countryside, peasants demanded land reform that had long been delayed. At the same time, another form of political power was developing alongside the government. Workers and soldiers had begun forming councils known as Soviets. These assemblies represented factory workers, soldiers, and other ordinary citizens. The most influential of these organizations became the Petrograd Soviet. For a time, Russia experienced what historians often describe as a situation of dual power. The provisional government held official authority, but the Soviets possessed significant influence among workers and soldiers. In this uncertain environment, a revolutionary leader returned to Russia. His name was Vladimir Lenin. Lenin had spent many years in exile. But in April of 1917, he arrived in Petrograd with a bold message. He argued that the revolution should not stop with political reform. Instead, he believed power should pass directly to the Soviets. His famous slogans were simple and direct: peace, land, and bread. Looking back today, it becomes easier to understand why these words resonated so strongly. Millions of soldiers were exhausted by war. Peasants longed for land of their own. Workers struggled with food shortages and unstable wages. Lenin's message spoke directly to these frustrations. His political movement, known as the Bolsheviks, gradually gained support within the Soviets. Meanwhile, the provisional government faced increasing difficulties. One of its most controversial decisions was the choice to continue fighting in the First World War. Many soldiers and civilians hoped for peace, but the government feared that withdrawing from the war might weaken Russia's position internationally. This decision deepened the divide between the government and the population. By the autumn of 1917, the political situation in Petrograd had become extremely fragile. The Bolsheviks believed the moment had arrived to seize power. Their strategy was carefully organized. Under the leadership of Lenin and the revolutionary commander Leon Trotsky, armed supporters prepared to take control of key locations in the capital: railway stations, telegraph offices, bridges across the Neva River. Late in October, the plan was set in motion. Red Guard units moved quietly through the streets of Petrograd. Most government resistance was limited. Many soldiers had already shifted their loyalty toward the revolutionary cause. The final symbol of the provisional government's authority remained inside the Winter Palace. This vast building had once been the residence of the Tsars. Now it housed the ministers of the provisional administration. During the night of October 25th, Bolshevik forces surrounded the palace. After several hours, the building was entered. The remaining members of the government were arrested. In that moment, power passed into the hands of the Bolsheviks. For Lenin and his supporters, the event represented the beginning of a new political order. They declared that authority now belonged to the Soviets, and they began forming a government based on revolutionary socialist principles. Yet the events of October did not immediately bring peace. Instead, they marked the beginning of another difficult chapter. Across the vast territories of the former empire, different groups resisted Bolshevik rule. Supporters of the old monarchy, liberal reformers, and regional armies formed opposition movements. Soon, Russia descended into a long and devastating civil war. Looking back across the centuries we have explored in this story, one cannot help but reflect on how extraordinary the transformation had been. From the early forests of Kievan Rus to the rise of the Tsars to the vast empire built by Peter and Catherine, the Russian state had changed many times. But now, in the year 1917, an entirely new system was emerging, one that would reshape not only Russia, but much of the world in the decades that followed. And so, our long journey through the history of Russia slowly comes to rest. From the quiet forests of Eastern Europe to the rise of great cities beside wide rivers, we have traveled across more than 1,000 years of history together. In the beginning, there were only scattered Slavic villages, small communities living among rivers, forests, and open plains. Their lives followed the rhythms of nature, the changing of seasons, the slow movement of trade along the waterways. And over time, these scattered settlements gradually became something more. The city of Kiev rose beside the Dnieper River. Princes ruled from wooden halls, churches lifted their domes toward the sky, and a new cultural world began to take shape. Then, from the distant steppe, came the thunder of Mongol horsemen. Cities were destroyed, kingdoms fell. Yet, even during those difficult centuries, life continued. Villages rebuilt, faith endured, and slowly, in the forests of the north, a new center of power began to grow. Moscow. At first, it was only a modest town. Wooden walls surrounded quiet streets, but its rulers were patient, generation after generation. They expanded their influence, until at last the Mongol shadow faded, and the princes of Moscow became rulers of a vast land. From there, the story continued to unfold. Ivan the Terrible proclaimed the title of Tsar. Peter the Great built a new capital beside the Baltic Sea. Catherine the Great expanded the empire across enormous distances. For centuries, Russia grew into one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. Its borders stretched across forests, steppes, mountains, and frozen northern seas. Yet history rarely moves in straight lines. Periods of expansion were followed by moments of uncertainty. Reform brought hope, but also tension. War reshaped the balance of power, and the great empire built by the Romanov Dynasty eventually reached its final chapter. The revolutions of 1917 brought an end to the world of the Tsars. A new political system replaced the monarchy, and the long imperial era quietly closed. Looking back across this story, one begins to notice something interesting about history. Empires rise, empires fall, but the people who live within them continue their lives. Farmers still plant crops in the spring. Merchants still travel along rivers and roads. Families gather beside warm lamps in the evening. In many ways, daily life moves forward. even while great political changes unfold. Perhaps that is one of the most calming thoughts history can offer. The centuries move slowly, generations pass, and the world continues to change, little by little. If you imagine the landscapes of Russia now, you might picture wide rivers reflecting the pale northern sky, forests stretching across quiet hills, snow falling gently over distant villages. Somewhere in those landscapes, church bells ring softly in the distance, and the long story of the past settles peacefully into memory. Thank you for spending this time traveling through history. If you enjoyed this quiet journey, you might consider subscribing to the channel so we can explore more stories together in the future. But for now, there is nothing more you need to do. Just rest. Let the mind wander gently across the centuries we have explored tonight, and allow the quiet rhythm of history to slowly fade into sleep.